Good evening. Welcome to TD Presents The Walrus Talks Inclusion. My name is Sherry Austin, and I'm a proud Walrus board member and a supporter of the Walrus Foundation. We're here in spectacular, sunny Vancouver, which is my hometown, on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We gratefully acknowledge their hospitality. We're thrilled to be here for a conversation with you about a critical issue in Canada, inclusion with a particular focus on disability. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome to the stage Her Honor Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, Janet Austin, no relation, a Walrus talker herself prior to her appointment. We're delighted to have you back with us.
Related only, I think, by a shared interest in public policy, Sherry. So good evening, everybody. As you heard, my name is Janet Austin, and it is my enormous privilege to serve as the 30th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. I, too, would like to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, upon whose traditional territory we gather today, and to thank them for sharing these lands in peace and friendship. Haichka. I'd also like to acknowledge Inspector Bob Tsui, who joins me today as my honorary aide-de-camp. It's always a pleasure working with Bob, except that sometimes people think he's the Lieutenant Governor. You'd be amazed, it does happen. As you heard, I had the privilege of speaking at a past Walrus Talk event, and I found it to be truly inspiring and intellectually stimulating evening. I believe it's vital that we support events like this, which provide a valuable platform for public discourse on some of the most pressing issues facing our society. It's been just over a year since I was sworn in as Lieutenant Governor, and during my first weeks in office, I identified 3 themes that would serve as guiding principles for my mandate. And they are, briefly, supporting the reconciliation process with British Columbia's Indigenous peoples, promoting civic engagement and democratic literacy, and fostering a more diverse and inclusive society. Tonight, we're here to talk about inclusion, and specifically how we can remove barriers for people with disabilities, whether they are tangible, such as physical barriers in our workplaces and community spaces, or intangible, such as stigmas, unconscious bias, outdated workplace policies, and government legislation. Here in British Columbia, I believe that we can lead the country in recognizing that people with disabilities have enhanced skills and aptitudes that can flourish when they have proper nurturing. Take, for example, the work of the President's Group, a collective of BC leaders, including people like Craig Richmond, Tamara Vrooman, Kirsten Sutton, Wendy Lissagar-Kokia. These people have bonded together to create workplaces that recognize the strength of people with disabilities, that foster accessible environments, and model inclusion in workplace culture. Another shining example is one of our speakers tonight, Rick Hansen, an inspiring and iconic British Columbian whose tireless efforts over 3 decades have truly moved the dial for Canadians with disability, and thank you for that, Rick. So this is exciting for all of us. It's about developing a culture of belonging that values difference as a strength. It's about empowering the millions of Canadians living with a disability to unleash their full potential. And at its core, it's about creating a healthier and a more resilient Canadian society, a society that is balanced with a place for all. I very much look forward to our conversation tonight. Haichka, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. How many of you are here at your first Walrus Talk? Wow, amazing. A special welcome. We hope to see you again. This optimistic project called the Walrus started 16 years ago. Our purpose is to promote and facilitate the fact-based, complex, and sometimes difficult conversations that are vital to Canada. These conversations take place in the Walrus magazine at thewalrus.ca and at Walrus Talks across the country in rooms like this. No matter where the Walrus is or how you engage, the common threads are our signature commitment to independent, fact-based journalism and our efforts to bring together a diverse group of interesting and interested Canadians who care about the issues that matter. There is no way we can do the work we do without our partners, and tonight we're pleased to present this event with the support of TD Bank Group. Here's how the Walrus Talks works. Each talker has 7 minutes. They'll come up one after another introducing themselves. Please follow along in the program. Speaker order is on one side and the bios are on the other side. After you've heard 7 talkers for 7 minutes each, your head is full of new ideas. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the post-talks reception over wine and snacks. Just before I ask our talkers to get underway, I'd like to thank all of them in advance. Thank you to Rick Hansen, founder of the Rick Hansen Foundation, Shelley Moore, UBC PhD candidate and inclusion advocate, Rich Donovan, CEO of the Return on Disability Group and author of Unleash Different, Vivian Ly, Executive Director of Autistics United Canada, Jules Smith, Chairperson, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, Neil Belanger, Executive Director, BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society, and Ricardo Wagner, Microsoft Accessibility Lead, Microsoft Canada. Thank you for coming. One thing I'd like to ask you is to hold your applause due to auditory sensitivities. This may be difficult because our speakers are going to be fantastic, but please try and remember that. First up is Rick Hansen.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Sherry, and what a privilege it is to be here, to join the Walrus Talks, and of course, to be in the presence of our Lieutenant Governor, the Honourable Janet Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. It means a lot. And to be here with other panel members who have come together with their expertise to be able to help focus on solutions and thoughts and ideas about moving barriers, removing them, getting them out of the way so people can live to their full potential. Thanks to Shelley, Rich, Vivian, Jules, Neil, and Ricardo for all of your fantastic work. And ultimately, I think it's really important for us to realize that disability is a big deal. What do I mean by that? Well, the stats show that there's 1 in 5 Canadians living with a disability today. The World Health Organization says there's 1.3 billion people on the planet with a disability, the world's largest minority. And aging baby boomers are coming, and that number is expected to grow exponentially. And we have legislation. What is that? We also have the emerging economy, which you'll hear more about from Rich. And why is it then, if such a big deal exists in Canadian society, that we've made actually such little movement in the social dialogue, in the cultural dialogue, in human rights? Well, it's because largely lack of awareness that it is a big deal. It's fragmented by body type, by clinical diagnosis, by the plethora of so many people doing their great work, but very difficult for us to be able to come together and to find common solutions that really show the power of our community. And lacks jurisdictional fragmentation, harmonization doesn't seem to happen in this country, and it's imperative. And lastly, there are so many barriers and so many solutions. Where do we pick? I believe that anything's possible, but I've learned through my years that not everything, and focus is the key. And our organization is small, and we think about lots of things that are important, but today, really looking at some of the things that there's inconsistent, imperative and implementation on accessibility, because the interpretation is so different. Currently that power is held mostly by disability advocates who have a variety of perspectives, and they're considered, sort of secondary to the system. And the lack of the competency and accountability of the design and built culture tends not, and industry, not to truly reflect the issues of accessibility. So being able to focus on the built environment as a major priority really helps us to be able to address one of the most significant barriers for people with disabilities. If people can actually go to the places that they live, work, play, and learn, and they can be inclusive, to be recognized, to be valued, and to contribute, well, then we actually can make a difference. But really, our community actually is dealing with so many fires. There's so many reactive problems, and largely accessibility is thought to be a bit of an afterthought. Let's just talk to the advisors, and let's also see, the consequences, which are huge financial costs, lost opportunities when construction and retrofit or new buildings are being considered. These consequences are not sustainable. What are the solutions? Well, looking to the other fields like the LEED's energy efficient model for buildings, which is now a global solution and a best in practice standard, and it's moved beyond. Adopting the principles of universal and inclusive design, the most good for the most people. Training and accrediting professionals in the built environment to be accessibility experts, to normalize it. And then, of course, to be able to make sure that we have a common language, common measurement, and the ability to work on a common global standard. Accessibility certification was the top priority for our foundation, to be able to actually build that cohesive, collaborative coalition of people from the experts in the field of disability, the ability to bring organizations that represent people with disabilities together, private sector, and the built and design community to be able to be part of that solution together. Well, being able to think about it, we've developed a pilot project. We actually built a globally recognized curriculum of which could be the training basis for that accessibility expert team. And then we trained a series of accredited experts, and they went out and rated buildings. We learned, evolved, moved that pilot project into full-scale implementation now across this country. What we've been doing is now utilizing 6 colleges and universities to be able to teach that curriculum. And engineers, architects, city planners, advocates for the disabled, real estate folks are all working together, and we've rated over 1,100 buildings across the country. We're actually asking Canadians to measure up, and the percentages of that are very interesting. About 37% of those buildings were not to a minimum standard. 60% were, and we had about 3% which were gold innovation. Really cool and beyond the minimum standards. But we celebrate those and recognize them because incentives to move forward are really powerful. Being able to actually recommend a pathway for improvement once they've been assessed, and then to offer accessibility grants, especially for those that can't afford it, so they can actually get to and beyond the line faster. And of course, there's always waiting for that compliance to take place when enforcement comes as to whether you're in that minimum standard or not, at that minimum level of social safety net or not. You can actually look at that through legislation, through codes, and or the UN Convention on Rights and Freedoms for People with Disabilities in national reporting and measuring up. But we should try to move forward faster and not wait for that and see if we can actually move people together. How do we do that? We build a global movement. We actually have a vision that something made in Canada can connect people from around the world, over 100 countries, 250,000 accredited professionals, changing the design community and normalizing disability so that we actually have this issue behind us, so we can take care of the important human issues. And wouldn't it be great to be able to report on an annual index measuring where we are and actually continuing to track that until we can get to the goal. And then people know where Vancouver is relative to Tokyo or St. John's, Newfoundland, or Beijing, China. And this is the opportunity that we have. And there's a West Coast saying that says, rising tides float all boats. While there are many barriers, powerful and important things to deal with, if we can focus together, if we can join in this movement, I believe that it will energize the focus on awareness, on attitudes, on the need for employment, the power of an economy, social justice and human rights, and many, many of these other barriers. But let's get going. Let's work together. Together, we can get there faster. Together, anything's possible. Thank you.
How's everybody doing? There's a lot of you. Okay. So I'm Shelley, so let's make sure. Oh, look, that's big me. Okay, so here we are together. We are talking inclusion. If you know my work, you know that this is really the question that that I'm trying to answer every single day. And so my role is an advocate within the school communities around British Columbia especially. But this is the question, is how do we support inclusion? Are there any spelling mistakes in there? No, I'm looking at it this big. How do we support inclusion in our classrooms and our schools, especially as we're seeing as our population is becoming more and more diverse? And so this is the question that I often reflect on. And if you know anything about education, how this question has been answered over time is with special education. Have you heard of special education before? Of course you have, right? But the thing about special education is that it evolved out of the medical model, right? And so you know something's wrong, and you go to the doctor, and then they fix you. But we're learning a lot of things about disability, and the first thing is, well, maybe we don't want to be fixed. Maybe we need disability as much as anything that makes us diverse. And so because I'm a person who likes metaphors and I like visuals, I had to kind of think of a metaphor to help me understand what the alternative is. So if you've seen me present before, you may have seen this, but the idea is this. I think about all of the kids in our classrooms and the needs that they have and the supports that they need. And I imagine them, well, first of all, they have to be unsuccessful to get support. They have to fail, which to me is not okay. Like, this describes my experience in school along with many others. So I imagine all these little kids. And so I call this model the cupcake model of support. You have to fail, and then you go get sent to the cupcake that you need to eat from, right? Oh, you can't read. Go to the reading cupcake. Oh, you have a hard time speaking or communicating. Go to the speech and language cupcake. For generations, we've looked at our Indigenous learners and said, oh, you're broken too. Go to the Indigenous cultural cupcake, right? So this is what we've done. And so in order to access any of these supports, you have to first acknowledge that you failed. And I don't think you need me to tell you that there's a whole lot of kids who need support that don't have a disability. And so part of education that I find is really interesting is, especially in British Columbia, we're going through this huge paradigm shift right now where we're trying to figure out how do we meet the needs of kids with disabilities, but it's becoming bigger. Well, how do we just meet the needs of kids in general? And in that, sometimes we get caught in this paradigm of this medical perspective. And so what happens is we start advocating, but we're advocating for the wrong thing. We're advocating for more cupcakes. We could have all the funding in the world and never have enough cupcakes, right? And so the alternative is, well, what's the alternative to this? How can we actually meet the needs of kids? But the answer is not more cupcakes. The answer is to advocate for more batter. But when we're talking inclusion, the question is there a better way to use the batter? Is there a way that we can get supports to kids that don't rely on failure, that don't rely on crisis and trauma? And so, my friends, here is the solution. Well, one of many. Is if we advocate for more batter, we can use the batter better by advocating for the layered cake of support love. Which is, if you imagine every community, every classroom, every school, that cake is built for them. It's not based on failure. It's not based on disability. It's based on needs of that community. Those people in that community are the reason why supports come. We have contribution. We have strength. Everyone in that community gets a slice of that cake. You would never serve a cake horizontally. You serve it vertically. Everybody gets access to that cake. I have never met a kid who's not going to benefit from behavior support. I have never met an individual who's not going to benefit from literacy support, from cultural support, from identity support. These are not exclusive to disability. These are just parts of who we are. And so part of the advocacy that I have for inclusion is just this whole idea of how do we get supports to kids before they fail? We have to start realizing that our advocacy has to come in, these ideas of wraparound supports, not just for kids, but for the whole community. And those supports are determined by the people in that community, not by the failure as a result of that community. This is preventative. We're talking, like Rick is talking about this idea of retrofit. This isn't retrofit. This is we're baking a cake for this classroom. So this, my friends, is the work. What does this look like? What does this mean? This doesn't mean it's 27 people in one classroom, like adults, right? But this does mean, how do we design? We know what supports people need. We know what supports can be designed for specific groups of kids. So how do we support teachers and families and communities to design for everyone in that community so that everyone gets a slice of that layered cake of love? Friends, thank you.
Good evening, Vancouver. How are we tonight? Aces. So today we're going to take you through a quick conversation about accessibility versus experience. And we're going to get our slides up here, aren't we? Please. Thank you for not making me beg. So we're going to talk about the difference between accessibility and experience. A simple concept, very hard to do. So I'm going to walk you through quickly what that looks like, how we do it day to day in complex organizations, and how we make that work from a public perspective. All in 7 minutes. No pressure, right? Next slide, please. So this is an advertisement that you will never see. If you see this advertisement, it means somebody at Walmart lost their jobs. You would never see a store advertise the fact that they have front doors. Ever. Why? Because people don't go to stores for front doors. They go for what's behind the door. For Walmart shoppers, they go to Walmart because they get great stuff at low prices. Pretty simple, very good. But we do this in disability every damn day. We look at minimums, we look at standards, we don't look at the experience of the customer. And that, we have a technical word for it, it's called stupidity. We wonder why this doesn't work. Well, you would never see a business do this. You'd never see government do this. So why in disability do we do this every day? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, but the big reason is we don't talk to the customer. We don't ask the customer what they want. We assume all they want is to get in the front door. Now, I will tell you, over the last 10 years, we've talked to about 3,000 people with disabilities. I have yet to hear one of them say, I just want to get in the front door. Yeah, that's still what we're doing. Next slide, please. So what if we looked at disability as a marketplace? What does that look like? Well, a market is easy to define. It's a collection of people with demand dates and supply dates. And in disability, that's roughly 1.7 billion people around the world. Roughly 25% of the population, according to StatsCan, it could be as high as 33%. All those folks have common demands, common needs, and they have a lot of cash. And from a business perspective, that's a very good thing. For every person with a disability, there are 1.85 people directly connected to them. We call those friends and families. Now, don't ask me how we get to 1.85. It's a very boring, long story that we don't have time for today. But they represent another 16 million Canadians. When you put those two populations together, you're talking about 63% of consumers. Let that sink in for a second. 63% of consumers are directly connected to disability. This is not a niche. Now, it's been 20 years since I've been to business school, so I may have forgotten what niche means, but I'm pretty sure 65% is not niche. The key is you never design for people with disabilities. Why? Because your product wouldn't sell. People with disabilities don't want disabled products. They want the core experience. They want the thing everybody else wants. In fact, they're hungry for it. They're demanding it, and they'll actually pay more for it, which is, as an economist, is delightful to me. So the key is not to design for disability, it's to design from disability. And bring those disability use cases to every other experience. Next slide, please. What's the goal? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to build doors that are 69 centimeters wide? No. Why? Because very few people care. They just want to get in the damn building. Getting in the damn building is part of a process. The end goal, as this precocious 3-year-old is demonstrating, is to be delighted. Delight is a very powerful word. It's emotional, it conveys satisfaction, and it's rarely linked to legislation. In fact, the only person delighted by legislation is a lawyer. My apologies to all the lawyers in the audience. Actually, not really. So, as we're figuring this stuff out, and as we're working with large organizations to get this right, the goal has to be delight, not accessibility. Accessibility can be part of that conversation, but it cannot be that conversation. And that's where we are today. We spend all of our time talking about minimal access and frankly struggling mightily to get there. But it's actually a very small subset of getting to delight. The good news is organizations are really good at delighting people. They just have never thought about delighting people with disabilities. So my challenge to you today is struggle with delight. Figure out the things that you had to do to cause delight in your customers with disabilities, and by doing so, delighting your core customers. Here's a hint. It's pretty easy to do. You just gotta refocus, change your mindset, and work like hell to get it done. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Hi everyone, I'm Vivian Ly, and today I want to talk to you about spaces, about occupying spaces, embodying spaces, sharing spaces, and about creating spaces. We are all a part of many spaces, at school, at work, at home, and in our communities. There's the physical space of land, water, air, buildings, and roads. There's the social space that we create with one another through language and communication. There's the internal space that we occupy in our own bodies and minds. And then there's the external spaces that we share with everyone else. These spaces all come with their own structures and their own rules, too. And unless you live in the wilderness all on your own, you spend most of your time living in shared human-made spaces. These are human-made structures, human-made rules. And the good thing about this is if we understand that our built environment and social environment are created by people, then we know that these are things that people can change. They can be improved, things can be thrown out. Assumptions, rules, and structures can be completely upended if they don't serve our needs. The beauty of inclusion and access is then to struggle together to create spaces that meet the needs of everyone, particularly those who have been traditionally excluded from spaces. I'm speaking about disabled people, of course, but also racialized people, women, low-income and homeless people, LGBTQ people, children and elders, fat people, immigrants and refugees, those of us living at the margins and the margins of margins. I want to bring up two common mistakes when designing and creating inclusive spaces. The first is simple: not listening to disabled people. So much of disability activism is telling people that the thing that you just did there to help disabled people actually hurts us. This gets in the way of real progress when so much of disabled people's energies is devoted to correcting well-meaning but ultimately harmful attempts at inclusion. An example of this are newfangled disability gadgets like gloves that purportedly translate ASL into English, when deaf and hard of hearing people have been speaking up for ages that what they need is actually better access to ASL interpreters, and better access to ASL language education. Or stair climbing wheelchairs, when the real issue is that the built environment relies so heavily on stairs, and that there's a choice on the architect's part to not include things like ramps or elevators. An expensive, clunky stair climbing wheelchair is no use to someone like me who can rarely climb stairs because of chronic pain, but doesn't use a wheelchair, or a parent with a stroller, or a worker with a rolling cart, for that matter. As well, there's the whole issue concerning the dominance of behavioral intervention for autistic people in our schools, in therapy clinics, in our homes. Increasingly, autistic people are speaking up about the long-term trauma that comes from the use of rewards and punishment to teach compliance to neurotypical standards. Research is starting to reflect what we've been saying all along, that suppressing natural autistic traits like intense interests or stimming, passing as normal or whatever normal is, takes a huge emotional toll, one linked to our incredibly high suicide risk. There's a real harm that can result from wanting to make an autistic person indistinguishable from a neurotypical peer, when it's absolutely possible to be a happy, thriving autistic person, and an autistically happy person, if you will. Autistic people are calling instead for more supports and therapies that work with autistic traits rather than against them. So, when attempts at inclusion go wrong, really it's when they promote segregation, compliance, control, at the loss of dignity, autonomy, choice, and freedom to be ourselves. Notice that these failed attempts are often entirely focused on the individual, putting the onus on the disabled person to accommodate abled people, rather than ensuring that our spaces are built for all. They are Band-Aid solutions, rather than long-term commitments. Okay, Vivian, you say, I get it. Listen to disabled people. Change the environment, not the person. What else? The second big mistake when creating inclusive spaces is thinking about inclusion only on one axis. For example, I'm not just disabled, I'm also Cantonese. As an adult, trying to reconnect with my local Cantonese community, I encounter stairs-only routes to meeting spaces, harsh migraine-inducing fluorescent lights, expectations to conform to neurotypical social standards, and a lack of understanding about autism in general. However, after I was diagnosed with autism, I also sought out other autistic and disabled people to connect with. But I found these spaces, these disability spaces, to be overwhelmingly white. Black, Indigenous, people of color, mixed race people are no less likely to be disabled than white people. So why are there so few people of color in disability spaces? Soon enough, I encountered both overt and covert forms of racism, which pushed me out of many of these spaces. Of course, these issues about access are not unique to Chinese community spaces, and these issues about racism are not unique to disability spaces. But let me tell you, it's so hard to find a space that will hold even two of my identities dealing with race and disability, let alone one that will embrace and make space for someone who is also a queer person, a survivor, and a child of refugees. There lies the danger of thinking about inclusion only on one axis, of not accounting for those of us who find ourselves in the intersections of multiple communities. So I'm going to throw some questions at you to think about. Who's not in the room? Even right now, here as we speak about inclusion in this very space, who is not in this room? And what do we lose from that? For those of us who are in the room, who's comfortable and safe and who is not? Who has to contort and mold themselves painfully to fit into the majority? Who is part of the majority? Do they even realize that they're part of the majority? And finally, who is creating these spaces? Is it made with us, by us, or without us? There's a slogan among disability activists, nothing about us without us. I'll say that again, nothing about us without us. So spaces are really important to me. Inclusion and access to spaces where decisions are being made are important to me, because that's just the first step. If disabled people can't even enter a room and get a seat at that table, how are we going to address pressing issues such as the high rates of homelessness and unemployment among disabled people? How are we going to address the fact that disabled people face horrific abuse and neglect in institutions and neo-institutions, sometimes even their own families? How are we going to address the incredibly high risk of suicide in autistic adults, a shocking greater than 70%? How are we going to address the additional disparities for disabled women, disabled people of color, LGBTQ disabled people? How are we going to create not only access, but also create changes in the conditions that made the inaccessibility in the first place? And disabled people do need a seat at that table. More than that, we need to make the table ours, full of everyday, average disabled people. Non-disabled parents and allies may have great input to share, but they can't replace autistic and disabled voices and leadership. A wide variety of disabled people need to be enacting this change, not just disabled people, and not even just a subset of disabled people. Again, nothing about us without us. We are the real experts of our own lived experiences. And when that expertise is called upon, Belanger work includes paying for it, paying us for it, because it is work. It's not something to be taken for granted. Inclusion in this sense isn't charity. It's our human right to be heard, to have our work recognized as work, and to be in societal spaces that have excluded us in the past and continue to exclude us today. Okay, so spaces are important to me because to me, they are centers of change. They're where we create community and share our lives with each other. Creating spaces is loving one another. It's saying, I see you, I honor you. Creating an inclusive space intentionally, no matter how small or how big, is so, so important. And it takes all of us, because we all create spaces by the virtue of being in them and acting in them. I'll leave you with one last question. What kind of space are you going to make?
Hi, good evening. Thanks, everybody. These are such great talks. I'm so excited to see some friends and colleagues and an individual who shares one of our committee members on our PhD journey. It's lovely. I just want to share with everybody, you've probably seen some of us at the front started this, but instead of applause, we've been doing this. So tonight you've all learned a new ASL sign. This is applause in ASL, and it's a really powerful way to respect the need for people to have sensory kind of space where they're not overwhelmed by the clapping. So I'm Jewel Smith, and I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about a particular area of disability tonight. It's the topic of my PhD studies, which is mothering and disability, mothering and human rights. Eventually, it's my hope that all disabled mothers will achieve full citizenship as laid out in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 23. If you want to take the time to read that another time, I'm not going to get into the details. For over 15 years, I worked to advocate for equality and inclusion of all persons with disabilities in all aspects of their lives. And I've come to believe that a key barrier to inclusion and full citizenship is the paradigm or the model from which we operate, each of us. That is, how we understand and interact with individuals and citizens who are different than the assumed majority, who are different than the circle that we operate within. And I just want to thank Shelley for opening up the conversation of models earlier with talking about the medical model. First, I'd like to just invite each of you to take a moment and consider your thoughts on disability. Can you just reflect and consider how you feel about people with disabilities? So what were your thoughts? Did you think about the Paralympics? Did you think about a story of someone you read about or met who was heroic, who did something incredible despite having a disability? Did you feel pity for someone you read about who had an injury that was unexpected, perhaps on the job, that changed their life, or a friend who suddenly found themselves living with MS or another disability? Did you ever think that perhaps you could never live your life that way? Did you think about how relieved you are that medical aid in dying is now an option in Canada? Or did you think about a family member, your child, your friend, yourself? So holding those thoughts in your mind, I'm going to talk about the two models of disability that I'm working from and comparing at the moment. One is the charity model and one is the human rights model. Models have the ability to peer using a lens at the practice, discrimination, barriers, attitudes, care, and the impact of the body on lived experience of disability. A model can help decipher and direct how other theories inform our understanding of policy, legislation, and practice. The charity model sees disability as something to be sorry for, a tragedy that we all can generously donate money towards and feel better about ourselves. And it has a number of direct impacts on the lives of people with disabilities. The charity model has created a system of bureaucracy that's difficult to navigate for many, and it's an ultimate barrier for people with disabilities. On the other end of the models is the human rights model that argues that people with disabilities are full rights holders and citizens, and as such deserve to have all the same rights and access as each individual in society. So why did I focus my research on disabled mothers? I embarked on this particular topic because I'm a third-generation disabled mother. My biological mother and her mother before her were born with genetic conditions that caused blindness. I have a different disability, but each of us in our own way through different generations of Canada's systems and laws have experienced barriers. This isn't the only reason why I focused on this topic, though. I believe that we are better people when we have diversity in our communities. That can be diversity of culture, education, sexuality, ability, disability. And third, I believe that we each fundamentally have a right to enjoy the full spectrum of human experience, including our right to have and be part of a family and to raise children of our own if we'd like. Often when I share the topic of my PhD with people who perhaps don't come from the disability community, the first question I'm asked is, which people with disabilities? I think that sometimes people focus on their own idea of capacity and who should be raising a family, rather than what are the barriers inherent in our systems that prevent people from becoming mothers who maybe wanted to, or even just sharing parenting, being part of our global community and being part of raising children. So I'd like to challenge each of you to think about a personal assumption you've had about disability, and in particular about disabled mothers. And I'd like to ask you to think about shifting one of those thoughts tonight. I assume that because you're here, you're all interested in inclusion, and this is maybe an area you haven't thought often enough about. Did the speakers tonight change your mind on anything? Do you have questions? What would you do to create a better and a more inclusive community for disabled mothers that you encounter? I believe that true change occurs every day in our encounters with individuals and with other community members and in the conversations that we have. So tomorrow in your work, if you encounter a mother with disabilities, how would you be more inclusive? Would you think about any assumptions you have? I think it's important to also always assume that people with disabilities are the experts in our own lives. If you're not sure about something, we don't mind just, asking us a question. If we don't want to engage in the question, we'll just tell you. We're good at that. But sometimes it's a lot easier just to say, hey, how can I make sure this space is more inclusive? How can I make sure that your experience as a mother is as fulsome as any other member of our society? And on that note, I look forward to any questions and keep an eye on my research. I'm really hoping to have a full rough draft of my dissertation in a year, and I'm just about to embark on interviewing mothers, and I'm so excited to hear their stories. Thank you.
Simgiget, Sigirimhanak Kobulsik. Before I begin, I'd just like to take the time to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsui First Nations, whose territories we're meeting on today. As was noted in my bio, my name is Neil, and I'm the Executive Director of the British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disabilities Society. And before I begin, I understand that this is going to be broadcast later on YouTube, and my daughter is a big YouTube fan, so I would ask you this. Could you all say in a quiet tone, hello, Katie? Hello, Katie. I also have a son, but he's bugging me, so you don't have to say anything to him. It's not very inclusive, but that's how it is. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to speak with such a distinguished panel and interested participants here in the audience. When I was first asked by Kaylin, wherever she is, to speak, I wasn't really familiar with a Walrus talk event, so I asked her what she wanted me to speak about specifically. And she said, Neil, speak about whatever you feel comfortable with speaking about. So I thought about it for a while, and after quite a bit of consideration and a thought process, I came up with a topic that I thought was relevant provincially, nationally, and internationally. And of course, that would be, who was the best captain of the USS Enterprise? Was it Kirk or was it Picard? And of course, it was Kirk. So, instead, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our organization, BCANS. So has anybody ever heard of BCANS before here in the audience? A few of you? So we're an Indigenous not-for-profit organization which has been established, which was established in 1991. We're the only Indigenous disability organization of our type in Canada. So when you talk about inclusive communities and accessibilities and having supports, that really says something about the Indigenous disability sector. We hold consultative status with the United Nations, and we provide services both within First Nations communities and non-First Nations communities across British Columbia. And typically, we maintain about 8,000 client files. We work in different areas, including case management, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, PWD, Persons with Disabilities Adjudication for the benefits, and a lot of work within accessibility from an Indigenous context. And that includes Bill C-81, which is the federal accessibility legislation. Are you familiar with that? That's out now, going through. National Accessibility Week, and the upcoming developments of accessibility legislation within the province of BC. So we're busy. We also created Indigenous Disability Awareness Month, and that was an initiative that was created to highlight the significant contributions that Indigenous persons living with a disability bring to all of our communities, and also the barriers that they face. This has been recognized here in BC and Saskatchewan by the Assembly of First Nations, Métis Nation BC, and many others. And it was recommended to Canada by the United Nations to proclaim and recognize Indigenous Disability Awareness Month annually. And why is that important? It's important because inclusion of this segment of our population is not there, and it hasn't been there for a long time. We've made some steps forward, but we have a long way to go. When we talk about Indigenous disability in Canada, we know that with any person living with a disability, accessibility issues are a problem. Government policies that are restrictive, the cross-jurisdictional issues that Rick spoke about, all those things play a factor. And that's no different within the Indigenous sector. The frequency of disability among Canadians is approximately 22%. Within the Indigenous community, it's about twice that. And other research has shown that it's even 3 or 4 times higher in different age groups. And we know that the prevalence of becoming disabled for Indigenous women, for impoverished populations, such as conditions seen within many First Nations communities in Canada, and neighborhoods significantly increase. In 2016, 80% of the First Nations in Canada had a medium income below the poverty line. BC, of course, enjoys the highest number of First Nations communities in Canada at about 203, and we have about 270,000 Indigenous people living within the province. And when we apply that rate, we can conservatively say there are about 82,000 Indigenous people of all ages living in our province. But despite that, we often find ourselves as the ands. And so when I say the ands, I'm talking about inclusion within disability sector, inclusion within developing policies, just inclusion across the board. And that comes from both government and from our civil society partners as well. We're often put in a place where people will develop policies, or governments will develop policies, or organizations. They'll put them in place, they'll have them ready to go, and then they'll say, oh, and we better include the Indigenous. And we've got to get past that. If we are truly going to be an inclusive Canada and a progressive Canada, then those are barriers and those are obstacles that we got to get out of the way. And we focus on that at BCANS, and we've really tried to move the needle forward, but we've got a long way to go. And before I leave here tonight, I just want to say, despite the work that we all have to do, and we have to do it together, and to make Canada a truly accessible and inclusive country, regardless of our ancestry, of our color, or gender, or perceived ability. BC is the province that the rest of Canada looks to when it's looking for innovation within the disability sector. BC has proven itself. We have a long way to go, but it is the leader in Canada, and I think that's something that everybody here should recognize and be very proud of. Thank you very much. Don't worry about clapping, nobody does anyways.
It's Microsoft. Without PowerPoint, we don't present. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the inclusion. I help organizations to create modern, accessible, and inclusive workplace. And I truly believe disability is an engine of innovation. To prove, I'm going to show a picture of a typewriter. And I decided to bring this picture because there are a lot of millennials in the room, probably watch this presentation online. that did not touch this machine before. Typewriter was invented by an Italian inventor called Pellegrino Tory, and he designed this machine to talk to his friend, Carolina Firenze. She was blind. And to communicate with her, for her to type letters legibly, the typewriter machine was ideal. And he designed this technology to communicate with a person with disability, but he quickly learned that more people could use this technology. And actually, during 200 years, typewriter machine was the main device in the workplace, school, everywhere. An interesting thing, the same typewriter layout is the same one you have in your phone right now. And I don't know if you ever asked it yourself, but I asked myself why the letters are in the way. And I will tell you why. The metals with the letters, if you type too fast, it could get jammed. And to avoid the situation, they figured out the best layout. And the layout you have today on your TV, on your car, your laptop, is still the same layout. And I tell you, in my generation, typing fast, and you're not going to find me here in the picture, it's just... But when I joined the workforce, I was advised to do a typewriter course. How many of you did a course around? Yeah. Typing fast was a big deal at that time. People were mentioning in their resume, say, hey, I typed the number of words. Typing was the way to interact. And today there are so many more ways for us to connect, to interact, like a phone, right? I can work with a phone. By the way, a phone, I have an interesting thing to talk about phone. Alexander Graham Bell, when he was researching to help hard of hearing, his wife and his mother, both of them were hard of hearing. He ended up discovering the telephone. Vincent, you're going to remember this name. He was trying to communicate with his wife. She was also hard of hearing. He wanted to communicate remotely with her. And he ended up discovering the email protocol. So the email technology that you exchange was also inspired in persons with disabilities. I bet you're going to see your phone now in a different way. Your phone is the end line of many inventions inspired in persons with disabilities. I truly believe disability is an engine of innovation. The World Health Organization defines persons with disabilities not as a personal health condition, but a mismatched human interaction. If you create the right environment and you connect abilities to technology, that's the point where you drive innovation. Somehow, Pellegrino Tory, Alexander Graham Bell, Vincent, they realized this. When they designed with persons with disabilities, they ended up creating more solutions for temporary, for situational, or even persons without disabilities. And today, we are not limited to work with typewriters or just with keyboard. There are so many more ways for us to connect with technology. We can connect with voice, with touch, with inking, with our eyes. Software technology is now capable to help people with invisible disabilities like mental health or learning disabilities. The technology that I'm showing right now is called Microsoft Learning Tools. It was designed to help kids with disabilities to write and read, and it's now used by 15 million people worldwide monthly. Monthly. I don't know if you heard about Sing AI app. It was an app designed by blind engineers at Microsoft. And it's an app that used the telephone to narrate the environment and help the person to read a menu, do shopping, scanning barcodes. You can see how much money you have. And this is the #1 app for the blind today, available in Apple Store for free. There are more. There is a technology called eye gaze control. We designed for ALS and people with quadriplegia. But here's the interesting thing. In hospitals, doctors are also using this technology. It's good for them. They don't need to take out the glove, wash their hand, and go to a keyboard. They can use eye control and avoid contamination. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking if Alexander Graham Bell, if Pellegrino Tory, if they were here, I think they would be amazed, just amazed, with all possibilities to connect and talk to everyone. But at the same time, they would be shocked to know, first, the amount of people with disabilities in the world, according to United Nations, 1.3 billion. In Canada, 8.3 million people. And they would be surprised that people are not leveraging technology and are not leveraging everything that is available to create inclusion. The sad thing, unemployment rate for persons with disabilities is 2 times higher compared to persons without disabilities. My humble point of view, it's not about technology, it's about attitude. Attitude towards inclusion. Attitude from leaders, from employers, from the government, from everyone here in the room, or everyone watching online. How we create a world that includes everyone. I want to leave a takeaway, which is a very simple one, and we use this principle when we design products at Microsoft. It's called inclusive design. You heard universal design, inclusive design. Universal is everything around our environment, our world, things you can touch. Inclusive design is everything that is online, software and services. The very first one is recognize exclusion. Very first one. When you make a product, when you design a solution, think who is not going to be able to use and why. Make it work. The second one, learn from diversity. Throughout this process, you're going to learn so much. The best tip I have for you, hire persons with disabilities. They're going to bring unique perspectives that is going to help you to enhance the experience. Last but not least, you're going to make it work for one, and you're going to extend to many. At the end, this is an end-user experience, as our friend that spoke before, he said. So I hope by now you're going to agree with me. Disability is an engine of innovation. And next time you grab your phone and you start to use keyboard, or you make a phone call, or you exchange an email, think about this. Think about a technology that was designed for persons with disabilities, but it's now working for everyone. Thank you very much.
All right, now that our speakers are comfortably seated, I think we can have a round of collective applause for Rick Hansen, Shelley Moore, Rich Donovan, Vivian Ly, Jules Smith, Neil Belanger, and Ricardo Wagner, and also for our sign language interpreters. The Walrus is proud to recognize TD as our national inclusion partner. Thanks to TD's support, we're exploring issues related to disability and inclusion across all of Walrus's platforms, including through the creation of the TD Chair on Disability and Inclusion at the Walrus. And having spent my own career at RBC, these words have never passed my lips before. Yay, yay, TD, good job. All right. To tell us more, please welcome TD's Andy Cribb, Senior Vice President, Retail Banking, Pacific Region.
Wow, what an evening. And thank you for that lovely introduction, Sherry. It's an honor to be here representing TD, and I want to also thank our incredible 7 speakers for sharing their perspectives. Each of you brought something new to the discussion, something unique, something that people in the audience, I'm sure, can take away and has helped change their perspective, so thank you. You know, I'm reminded tonight on how far we have come as we understand accessibility, and for those living with disabilities. But I think tonight should also motivate all of us that there's still a long way to go. There's still more to do, and together we can take that journey together. TD is motivated to take that journey with you. Last year, TD launched what we call the Ready Commitment. So the Ready Commitment is our corporate citizenship platform around 4 major pillars that we want to invest in to create a more inclusive future for all of us. So those are helping together to create a vibrant planet, connecting our communities, helping people achieve better health, and helping people feel more financially secure. And we've committed $1 billion over the next 11 years, so by 2030, for investments in causes that lead us towards that more inclusive future. So these are big goals, and we know we can't do it alone. And that's why we partner with organizations like the Walrus Foundation, who have done a spectacular job putting on tonight's event, thank you, and a spectacular job putting on the entire series across Canada, where we bring together Canada's brightest minds on various subjects to have fact-based discussions on topics that matter, so thank you. So we know at TD, we're not just in the business of banking, we're in the business of people. We have 85,000 employees north and south of the border, and we bank over 20 million customers. About 6% of our employees are living with disability, both visible and invisible. And we work every day to make sure those people feel included, empowered, and valued. It also means making sure that they feel that they can reach their full potential. And we also are proud to support many organizations right here in British Columbia, like the Special Olympics, like the Power to Be Adventure Society, who provide inclusive programming to help people reach their full potential. So in closing, I truly believe that the conversation we're having here tonight is important. Tonight helps us learn about the realities of those living with disabilities, but also about each other. Tonight also helps us embrace our similarities and be empowered by our differences. I want to thank you all for having TD to be a part of this forum. Together is the only way we will be able to go on that journey working towards a truly barrier-free tomorrow. And I wish you all a very good evening, and I'll see you later. Thank you.
All right, taking a shortcut. Thank you, Andy. I'll now ask our Walrus talkers to head to the reception and not drink all the wine before we get there. And I'll keep the rest of you here for just a moment longer. We've now produced 106 Walrus talks, and almost every subject you can think of. And that means there are now more than 700 Walrus talkers and more than 700 7-minute Walrus Talks videos you can watch wherever and whenever you want. They're on the YouTube channel called Walrus Television. Just head to thewalrus.ca. You can also subscribe either later at thewalrus.ca or for your convenience right now at our table in the reception. Just for you, and only for tonight, a full-year subscription to the Walrus costs $25. In any case, please do sign up for the newsletter and make sure you don't miss any Walrus Talks. And because fake news is cheap to make, but fact-based journalism is expensive, we ask you to please consider joining our community of donors. Thank you to the 3 wonderful people in the audience who did make a contribution when they signed up for the talks. New donors are joining over 1,800 Walrus across the country who give annually. We believe that the health of our society depends on having access to quality, well-researched content that Canadians can trust. If you feel the same way, please take out your phone and go to thewalrus.ca/donate live and give what you can. Or if you would prefer to give in person, you can visit Tina in the lobby and she will be very, very, very happy to see you. As a charity, you will have a full tax receipt. A few last thank yous before we adjourn. Thank you to Andy Cribb, Valerie Pichet, Amy Hainan, and everyone at TD for their support of the Walrus and the incredible commitment to a brighter future for all. Thank you to our national partners, Air Canada, Inspire, Loblaw, and Shaw, and for being with us across the country. Thank you to the Walrus events team, Blair Elliott, Kaylin Cooper, and Tina Love, and to our Director of Strategy, Aimee Ippersel, and Director of Sponsorship, Andrea Boyd. And I also want to thank my fellow Walrus board members and supporters, Gretchen Ross, Chima Nikemdaram, Chethan Lakshman, and Robin McClay. Please join us at the reception where there's food and drink, and if you go, there will be good conversation. Remember, we are all the Walrus. Thank you for coming. Merci, miigwech. And after the reception, have a safe trip home. Thank you.